I'm Hans Johnson, and it's my pleasure to convene our session on the media, earning press, and how to tell the stories of C. diff survivors. I want to say thank you, first of all, to our special guest panel member today, Joyce Frieden, whom I'm going to introduce in a second. But first, I have a bit of housekeeping to convey, and that is to ask anyone who drove here today to please stop at the check-in desk right outside and pick up a parking pass. Let's try to stay on the good side of the rent-a-cops out here at Gallaudet University and not give them anything extra to do in their ticket writing today. So please stop outside, get a pass, and let's all keep today from any petty frustrations around parking violations. I'm very pleased that we get to come back together as advocates, not only to advocate, but also to learn and reflect. And part of what this session is about is learning and reflecting on telling our stories in the press and in telling our stories with policymakers. The two go hand in hand. One of the important points about media relations that I think is apparent in all of our discussions on C. diff was framed very well in the video that Christian used as the catalyst for our morning session. And it's a reminder that we should all take to heart. People are dying from an epidemic that we have not heard of in many cases. To have people dying and suffering from an epidemic that is unknown even in many medical circles, even by long-standing medical professionals, with symptoms that go unrecognized, is part of what we as advocates have to diligently counteract. The statistics are not happy ones, but we are moving them in the right direction. As Christian's presentation noted, less than a third of Americans know what C. diff is. Yes, we've moved the needle considerably, from 20% a decade ago to about 33% now. But almost all of the work that we do needs to have that sad but alterable fact at the heart of what we advocate. Because media and press still have an extraordinary role in counteracting that ignorance. And not just in doing the storytelling and information sharing that can counteract that ignorance, but for those of us gathered here, it is an important way of honoring the lives of those that we have lost and of turning, as Rumpelstiltskin would say, spinning the suffering from our own experience and of those close to us and of our caregivers in looking after us and helping get us through into the gold of good information and good press. That's what is at stake in our work to tell our stories in the media. I'm very pleased that we have with us today a real veteran of telling stories about medicine and about disease, illness, and treatment, who has devoted her career to making informed citizens and informed medical professionals a possibility. Joyce Frieden, in addition to being the Washington editor of MedPage Today, how many people here are subscribers to MedPage Today? Anyone? All right, great. That's great. MedPage Today serves an audience of more than 670,000 physicians throughout the U.S., so it's a very large and influential audience. But in addition to that work, I'm pleased to say that Joyce Frieden is also a native Ohioan who has done well here in the nation's capital for many years. She's the Washington editor of MedPage today. She began her career about 35 years ago working for Harcourt Brace Yovanovitch and edited Clinical Endocrinology News. She is also freelanced extensively, and some of her other freelance publications include United Press International, WebMD, and the Washington Post. And her byline has appeared in newspapers like Internal Medicine News, Family Practice News, and OBGYN News. She is also the recipient of the Jesse H. Neal Award for Editorial Excellence and a member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. Joyce is going to have a good chance to talk about her work and about how we as advocates can shape good media. But I want to call attention first, before we hear from Joyce and before we get into the storytelling obligations of our role as advocates, I want to look at one good example that all of you should have a copy of at your table. And that is the story of one of our own advocates here with us today, also an Ohioan, extra shout out for Ohioans, our good and fearless advocate both before the legislature and before her Central Ohio neighbors, Ann Fox. And I just want to point out two things before we talk about the process of advocates telling stories. One is that Ann's story was both a victory lap and a catalyst. Ann's story did two things. We were trying to find a way to celebrate a momentous victory earned last year through the work of advocates around stopping the CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services under the HHS, under the Department of Health and Human Services here federally, from taking away critical protections against medical injuries and incidents. One of the things that's so important about elevating what many of us always fear is inside baseball, the esoteric struggle for survival and for informed policymaking or regulatory action is not exactly front page news. And those of us who've been working in this field or tried to break through the lack of attention to C. diff and to counteract that ignorance often know or are led to know that this is not sexy work. And any news story that involves talking about diarrhea and talking about the symptoms of C. diff is not going to be treated often as the absolute important life or death news coverage that it really is. So we had that bias to break through in getting Ann's voice raised. But we also had something going for us. And this is what I want to frame this discussion with in part, which is that we have to find news hooks to make our stories relevant and to make our stories break through the ignorance and the intransigence even of healthcare coverage in America. We have to make our stories through the seizing at other items that are in the news a battering ram to break through that ignorance and that intransigence, or the stubborn disregard for suffering and for grief that many of us experience and that provides a constant obstacle to informed attention to our lives and the policies that protect us. So one of the things that's important about Ann's story here, number one, the Peggy Lillis Foundation is here in part to help get stories like this into your local press, local blogs, and other local media. But number two, we're here to help identify some of those hooks, some of those news hooks, those pre-existing storylines or other major headlines that we can latch onto And by pulling with them, think of it like a grappling hook that you can throw up onto a surface or a wall and pull yourself forward. Or anyone who plays horseshoes here, think about throwing a lasso around that stake 20, 30 feet away and pulling yourself towards it. Those are what news hooks are. And in the case of Anne's, the news hook happened to be in the background here, rather implicit in the story and not quite obvious even to the informed reader. It just so happened that the week before this incredible victory that you in this room earned last August 2nd in getting this Department of Health and Human Services, no friends of the Affordable Care Act or of protecting vulnerable and sick Americans. But we won a major victory last August 2nd. But it just turns out, it just so happens, that the week before that happened, 5 cities in the heartland sued the administration over efforts to sabotage the Affordable Care Act. Those cities were Baltimore, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Chicago. And it was because of those cities and the press attention that that lawsuit about sabotaging enrollments and reimbursements to their city governments under the Affordable Care Act attacks that the administration had been engaging in. Those 5 cities had created a news hook in their local media environments around the argument of sabotaging the Affordable Care Act. And if it weren't for those cities, which I had to go through very diligently, seeing if the major newspaper in that city would cover this victory by our advocates, which happened the day after it. And it was in Columbus, Ohio, where we happened to have Anne, and where Anne's story happened to already be one that we were familiar with. She already happened to have had a previous piece that we'd placed in the Columbus Dispatch. And the people at the Columbus Dispatch were knowledgeable enough about their city's participation in that lawsuit over sabotaging the Affordable Care Act that the editors said, "We want this piece by Anne Fox." So what I'm saying is, we face a number of obstacles, but as advocates and working with the Peggy Lillis Foundation, we have the tools to help break through some of those obstacles and to get our stories the attention they deserve and to get our victories some of the deserved exposure that they need to break open this epidemic and to help raise the awareness that can move that needle northward from 33% recognition. With that, I want to welcome our special guest from MedPage today, the wonderful Joyce Frieden. Take it away, Joyce.
Thank you, Hans, and thanks, everybody, for being here this morning. As Hans mentioned, MedPage Today is primarily a medical news website, and for those of you who haven't signed up, it's free. So please go and check us out. And we really, even though our audience is mainly physicians, we really try to make it approachable for everybody and anybody to read our stories, and we love getting comments too. So our website has 2 kind of focuses of interest. One is that we have reporters who go to the clinical meetings, the infectious disease meeting or the cancer meeting, and report on all the latest studies that are coming out of those. And then we also cover the health policy developments, and that's what I do here in Washington with my colleague Shannon Firth. And so that, as you can imagine, is a pretty full-time job. We cover anything to do with Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, physician workforce, anything that affects the daily medical practice. So it's a big portfolio. And as I had mentioned to Hans, I have done a few stories on C. difficile. I do kind of dip my toe in the clinical water occasionally, and so I've done some work on fecal transplant, including about 10 years ago or so, or whenever it was first coming out. And and I also covered an interesting study about getting fecal transplant donors, which was an interesting poster that was presented at a meeting. But that, I have to say, isn't my primary focus usually. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was getting your message out to the media. And because I think the rules of that can apply to any story, including the very important story that you folks have to tell. And so I'm going to start with an example of somebody who, say, lives in an area where their local physician has just started an important research study on C. difficile. So let's suppose that you're very excited about this and you would like to get news of this out, maybe starting out by sending some emails to the local media to try to get press coverage. So one of the first things you need to do when you've identified who you want to send it to is make sure that you know who your audience, who their audience is. Who are they writing for? Who are they broadcasting to? I cannot tell you the number of press releases I get that are completely targeted wrong, and I'm going to give you some fun example of this at the end of my talk. So are they talking to patients? Are they, like our site, talking to professionals or doctors or pharmacists? What kinds of stories do they usually cover? Go through a few editions of whatever the outlet is and just see what they've done, either with C. difficile or with infectious disease in general. Just get yourself familiar with them. And then, of course, try to figure out the right person to contact. You can always send a general email, but it gets much more attention if you have a specific name of someone. And I can tell you that firsthand. And once you've figured all that out, then you want to sharpen your message. Anne's example is a great one. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the news hook. Or it doesn't even have to be a timely issue. If you have just something so compelling, somebody's personal story. Before I came here, I read Peggy's story, and I started to tear up. I mean, that was a really compelling story that really wanted to make me find out more about this illness and the toll it takes and what can be done about it. So that is just really important, sharpening your message. I wanted to give the example of a medical study. If it is information that is under some kind of embargo where it cannot be released before a certain date or time, you have to put that at the very top. Reporters need to know that as soon as they can. And then the next thing was that you should want to offer the reporter some kind of service, something they can't get anywhere else, like somebody's firsthand story. That's not something they can get elsewhere. Or if it's the local doctor, an exclusive interview with them. Getting an exclusive, really counts with our bosses. So that's something that's very valuable to us. The other thing is doing quick turnaround. That is so especially important in the digital age. I was covering, I think it was something like the Affordable Care Act lawsuit, the one in Texas. And I got a great email because I was looking for responses, and they said, great, we have this expert, send me an email and I'll hook you up. And so I sent an email and said, great, I need to talk to him, by, I think this was at noon, by 5 o'clock. Oh, sorry, he's not available today. Really not very helpful to somebody on a deadline. It's kind of a do or die moment. The other thing you can also offer, in addition to sending out your message to a targeted place, there are places that reporters go to sometimes when they can't find somebody to talk to. There are websites like ProfNet, PROFNET, and another one is called HARO, Help a Reporter Out. And so you can list yourself by topic area or whatever as an expert on a particular thing. And that is read by also other PR folks. And so they may, as well as reporters, and so they may get into contact with you. So those are kind of all the do's, the things you want to do. The things you don't want to do, number one, is overpromise. If you really can't get an exclusive with somebody, don't tell me you can, because let's just say I'm not going to come to you again. Don't pester people, although I will add a footnote to this. Getting emails for me, it's like a fire hose. I get 200 or 300 a day. What I don't get a lot of is phone calls. And it's not really that hard to find my phone number. I can give it to anyone who wants it. But
it's not that easy either. Just
right. Okay, well, yeah. But reporters are used to getting phone calls from people they don't know, because you never know who's on the other end of that phone. And even if they don't answer, if you leave a voicemail, I would just recommend don't overdo it. But if you send out your release, you haven't heard in a couple of days, sometimes a phone call can jar somebody into action. It's kind of the sneaky, old-fashioned way of doing things. And as I said, don't be inconvenient in terms of when somebody can reach you. I wanted to close up with a couple of interesting examples I've gotten over the years of people trying to reach out to our website. Here's one that said, "Hi, Joyce." So clearly did her homework on who to talk to. "I loved your recent article on the issues involving misdiagnosis." Now, there you go. Flattery will get you everywhere. And thought you might be interested in this infographic, etc. So, that's a great example of somebody who did their homework, caught my attention right away. And, we love to see that kind of thing. And now I will end with my favorite example. It's my bad example of what not to do. I got this 4 years ago, and I still treasure it. It says, "Good morning, editor." So clearly not somebody who's researched anything. "I have a unique unpublished piece written by orthodontist Dr. Jim Jones on why choose an orthodontist." So we don't cover orthodontia. We don't cover dentistry. Like, why would they even send this to us? "I chose MedPage," and so he goes on about what the thing says, and he says, "I chose MedPage today as the outlet to submit because of the ties that this article has to family wellness, parenting choices, and lifestyles. We think this would be a great fit." So again, although another thing that points out is to explain why you think something would be a good fit for your publication, although hopefully you'll be right, unlike this person. And finally, I considered this the icing on the cake. Additionally, if you would prefer to not have articles published by a registered orthodontist, we would be happy to let one of your staff writers take credit on this article and publish it under their name. So let me just add that final word of advice. Please don't be unethical. So that's really it. I'm happy to answer questions. I can't, talk very specifically about C. diff, but about Affordable Care Act or anything else going on in Washington, I will do my best. So thank you.
Before we get into questions, which I'm happy to moderate any questions for Joyce or for myself, or if people have any stories to tell about trying to tell your story in the press or on a local blog, I think this is an opportunity to reflect and to learn from each other about the process of addressing localized ignorance and to get C. diff more traction in our local and national press. But one piece I just want to talk about, because we seldom talk about it around earned media, is that earned media, like Ann's piece, or like another wonderful piece that Christian and the Foundation earned about this Advocates Summit in Infection Control Today, which is up on the Peggy Lillis Advocates portal on Facebook. I hope all of you are members of that important portal for information sharing. and for victory laps, like some of our earned media shared there often constitute. And it's important to do that. It's important to share and push out the earned media that we get. But the piece in infection control today that describes this very gathering here and our lobby day tomorrow and puts it in context with the 9-year effort to build the Peggy Lillis Foundation into the leading national voice for C. diff advocates and against healthcare infections, and for the work of advocates in building relationships with lawmakers and moving an agenda. That is a wonderful example of the earned media and storytelling that the foundation is engaged in. So there's a wonderful piece out there about even this summit. But the one thing that people seldom talk about around earned media is that it has other benefits for an organization. One of the benefits that a piece like Ann's gives us is not just that it runs in the Columbus Dispatch. Okay? In today's media environment, it is not enough to have a piece land even in a prestigious outlet like the Columbus Dispatch, the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, or MedPage Today. What is important in the aftermath, and which we need to think about even in our efforts to get to that publication, is how do we push out that story afterwards? How do we leverage that earned media for other recognition and for other eradication of ignorance and other purposes of our advocacy organization? One of the things I want to elevate here for us today is how earned media like Ann's can play a role in good local fundraising. Because some of the advocates here today have also taken on the role of building the individual donor base for the organization and doing what you can to leverage the support of your sphere of influence to make small dollar contributions towards the work of the Peggy Lillis Foundation. And I just want to highlight the value of this story and stories like it in ratifying the value of the organization and the mission of the organization in helping to raise the voices of survivors in fighting the epidemic. Because pushing out the story further and having a tool like this that can be shared in hard copy, online, on social media, reinforces that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. That we are part of something much bigger than ourselves, our own experience, our own suffering, our own individualized and family efforts to memorialize a loved one. We are involved in a movement. And stories like this help to showcase your participation in a movement that the Peggy Lillis Foundation is one conduit for. And so the carryover value from earned media like Ann's piece or like the Infection Control Today piece that Peggy Lillis Foundation has earned is that it ratifies the effectiveness of the mission of the organization and that you are part of a larger movement that has an ongoing struggle to prosecute, to wage. And that is how an organization grows, and it's how the individual components of our work, individual advocates, every one of us, can ratify our own participation in that movement and help to draw resources, can help to draw in more supporters, can help bring new followers to the webpage, to our social media channels, all of the work of movement building. So I just want to highlight the after-action components of good earned media, because in many ways, those are just as important as the work that went into getting it published in a reputable outlet in the first place. All right? Any questions for Joyce or myself? Christina.
Thank you. I have a statement and a question, and something that I thought my statement may be helpful to some of you who are intimidated with getting something published. So I personally this last year met with some doctors and asked them their concerns about overprescribing antibiotics, and then I went to write on my own article, which was pretty easy to do. You can get pictures and buy their rights for pretty cheap, and they posted it on their website, and it went viral, and then the Missourian contacted me, and then because they read my article, and then I was in the Missourian, and then an online paper from the UK contacted me because they saw the Missourian, and so then our story went to the UK, and then I saw that other people picked it up from, like Scotland and other places, and so it's really a chain of events, just getting involved in anywhere that you can, writing if you aren't being picked up, and likelihood is that you will be. And so I thought that was something that was very helpful there. And then I did have a question for you. Would you find, I know that you said that phone calls are effective, which I like because you do stand out that way. Would you think that maybe would it be okay if the first initial contact were a phone call, or do you think people generally prefer to be emailed and then called?
That is a fantastic question. I think probably they prefer to be emailed and then called, first of all, because if you've emailed them, then they have something to refer back to, and you have a good subject to, start out with them with. And then you can always, if they say, "Oh, I didn't see your email," and when you call them, you can always just resend it, and I'm happy to look at it again. Great question.
It is, and I'll just say from a mechanical standpoint, it's a very effective sequence because so many of us, especially reporters and editors, have very diligent spam filters. So part of the value of making that follow-up call immediately after sending a personalized email or in the next 15 to 60 minutes after sending an email is to ask, did you get the email from me? And in the case where they haven't, having them on the phone while you can resend that email is very important because you can get a direct confirmation, and often, from my experience, close your ears, Joyce, one of the things that it builds is a sense of accountability with the reporter or the editor that you're speaking to, that you've gone through the work of not only sending it, of formulating it, but resending it. And it clearly matters a lot to you that you bothered to check with them about whether they'd gotten it. It shows mindfulness about the dialogue of communication. And that is itself a kind of emotional intelligence, which tends to resonate with most reporters and editors. Yes, yeah.
I have to take a little bit of difference with my friend Hans, which is 15 minutes to an hour afterward, I would view as too soon. Give me a day, unless you're on serious deadline. Give me a little time to process it. Give me time to maybe take your idea to my editor before you call and see if I got the email. I will feel much less pestered than if you're doing 2 contacts at once for me. So.
Amen. Yes, and I think that's particularly true when it comes to op-ed content or opinion editors. There's a particular important strategy in dealing with opinion pieces and placing them in outlets, which is never use an attachment. Put the material that you are submitting or suggesting in the body of the email for multiple reasons. One, they're busy people. They don't often have time to click on an attachment and open it up. But 2, you want to circumvent the spam filter. You don't want your material lying around in the waste bin, essentially, because it had a PDF or a large file attached to it. And the beauty of submitting it in the body of the email, just as a little suggestion to folks, it shows that you are more experienced as a submitter and as a media relations advocate, because that is a standard practice, and if you do it, it suggests respectfulness to the op-ed editor or the opinion reporter, and it has the added benefit of immediacy. The content is right there. They can go right from your introductory message, which should be tailored, just as Joyce indicates, a thoughtful, personal message saying this is original content on a timely issue that I have firsthand experience with, and it involves X, Y, or Z sharp hook about experience or suffering or anything that dramatizes the immediacy of it. So those are just some technical tricks or best practices that can be very effective.
So I do actually want to say, for the people who are on the live stream, there is a little thing under the video that says questions, and they can actually ask questions as well that we will get via email, and then we can submit them to.
Fabulous.
So that's something to keep in mind, and we'll announce it again. And then we had a question here.
Actually, it was just more of a comment. Just wanted to add a little bit of advice, just because I've worked in the PR field for a bit as well. But just try to do a little bit of research on the reporter that you're contacting, because there are some that do appreciate phone calls, but there are many that don't. And a lot of people complain on Twitter about getting both emails and phone calls from folks. So just try to do a little bit of research on the reporter before you just bombard them with both emails and phone calls. Generally, if you look hard enough, you can find the way they prefer it to be reached out to.
And because you raised the multiple channels on which reporters and press is circulating, and that we have access to, and that we need to be mindful of in trying to break down the barrier to informed attention and recognition of C. diff. I'll use Joyce as an example. One of the prominent things in Joyce's bio, in any presentation of Joyce's credentials, is her Twitter feed. Joyce is active on Twitter. And so when you see that, it's a great channel, if not necessarily to contact Joyce about a pitch, it's to research past content that she has produced. Or you can see patterns in her reporting that indicate what are her key interests. And because Joyce is overseeing a lot of content, one of the other things that following her Twitter feed can reveal is what is really interesting to Joyce, because she's not putting everything up there that she oversees. You see the things that Joyce may be most interested in or most passionate about or have the most engagement with that she's choosing to put on her Twitter feed or choosing to comment about. So that is a helpful bit of background research about a local reporter in doing that personalized outreach that can help get your story some oxygen. Any more questions from the gallery here or from online? Because this is a great chance, again, to reflect and to learn from some of our victories, some of our failures, and some of the opportunities that we have seized or missed. And I really want to open it up for critical discussion as well.
So something that I think a lot of people in this room, depending on the perspective, and this is, I think, more for Joyce, that we struggle with is that we're dealing with a disease with C. diff, and where the primary symptom is voluminous diarrhea. And in working with an agency recently and trying to get more attention of this summit, they felt like that actually precluded us from being on morning drive stuff. Like the Morning Today show doesn't want to talk about diarrhea. And I think that that is something with this disease that we have to start to think about. And so how do we're not going to change the taboo overnight, though I'd like to change the taboo about it, but what might be some strategies for people who want to get it paid attention to, and get that symptom included, because the symptomology is very, very critically important, but kind of getting past the gatekeepers who are like, I don't want to talk about that. Because it's also odd, because in the other world of it is that I would guarantee you that if we went out today and stopped 10 people on the street and asked them if they've heard of a stool transplant or heard of C. diff, more of them would have heard of a stool transplant than would have heard of C. diff, because the media is obsessed with fecal transplants, which good for those of you who have had them, not being shady. But But I think that they're obsessed with that to the detriment of actually talking about the disease that was brought about to help treat. So there's an odd dynamic here where like some parts of the media are obsessed with poop, and then other ones are like, well, we don't want to talk about poop. So.
Fabulous. Yes, 2 points I want to raise. Number one, as a kid, when I was first approached by a physician asking me about the color of my stool, I thought she was talking about a chair. So let's remember that even when we talk about stool, that there is still unrecognition about the fact we're talking about poop. So that's an important, let's not use euphemisms, although that's an important medical term in itself, but remember that you have to speak in plain language and you have to look for recognition in your audience if you're talking face-to-face, and be sure that you are speaking not just to make a point, but so that you cannot be misunderstood in what you're saying about C. diff. That you have to be both proactive and preemptive in our communication on the issue. It's a theme that I go at very often in communications training with people. Proactive and preemptive. We want to speak to be understood, but we also want to speak sufficiently so that we cannot be misunderstood. And that's an important philosophy or strategic approach, especially in talking about C. diff. When it comes to gatekeepers, this is an incredibly sad but also beautifully ironic story. Because the morning drive time host of talk radio in one of the most conservative markets in our country, in Cincinnati, Ohio, himself came down with C. diff in 2016. And WLW's longtime drive time host had gone in for routine surgery and with an antibiotic prescription, ended up going home and suddenly developing this very explosive diarrhea and painful bloating, classic symptoms of C. diff. And lo and behold, he chose to disclose his condition, and partly because the radio station had to explain why he was missing so many of his stints. This is a regular presence on Cincinnati radio, more beloved by far than Marge Schott or Pete Rose in the city. And he came out about his C. diff story, and it's an illuminating example of how a local or national celebrity having the disease is an important wrecking ball to ignorance and lack of coverage of an issue. Now, has he chosen to engage with our Ohio advocacy campaign to help get meaningful C. diff legislation passed in Columbus? No. He and his agent passed on that opportunity, I'm sad to say. And I think it may have something to do with the lingering stigma of talking about his own experience with poop, may have something to do with sexism, and that men don't routinely talk about illness as much or think of themselves as having permission to talk about illness ourselves as women do in our culture, regrettably. But whatever the reason, having a prominent C. diff sufferer, such as comedian Tig Notaro, such as the story of Peggy Lillis, which has now been given leverage, but finding a prominent case of C. diff that already has some media standing or media presence is one important way to break through. So part of our work as advocates is to be those antennae out in the civic space of America in finding those local voices that can help bring attention to the illness and to the epidemic because of the attention and the following or the platform they may already have access to. There's a question over here. Oh, I'm sorry. Tony.
This is for the editor, Joyce Frieden, about dentistry. No, I'm just kidding. I heard everything you said.
Orthodontist. Who's going to ask you an
orthodontist? Yes. My question is, it's kind of a two-part. The first part is, when you read articles, let's say in Medical Air, and you contact that reporter, and and they're like, oh, we're not doing it right now no more. We're going to maybe pick this up in a year or two. How do we get... My question's kind of complicated. If we're talking about sepsis, C. diff, medical error, we can't just write one story. I understand you might bug the audience and they're like, enough of this. But if we raise enough issue and are repetitive like a gnat, I think people will get the picture. And I've called so many reporters throughout the country because I'm a gnat, and we've done enough articles on this. Why? And I understand, but why isn't my story good enough? Or why isn't Peggy's story good enough? Or why isn't Jocelyn's story good enough? Let's keep bringing the issue of saying the population is being affected. Population is dying. Families are getting destroyed. That's one question. I understand you guys are like, I can't keep writing about the same thing. But maybe if we do, we will bring C. diff to a different focus, sepsis, medical error, and we will maybe eliminate some of these problems.
Right. Well, I think you raised an excellent point. What you also raised for me was the fact that there are so many issues that are tied up in this. It makes me wonder if, and I hesitate in some ways to burden my fellow media outlets with this, but if you could raise in some ways a series, and talk about, I can write, 3 columns and just give a list of possibilities, because editors are always also looking for something like that to fill their space. So instead of just being the gnat about the one thing over and over and over again, if you're giving them different angles, it's a little something to hold on to. And also, one thing I forgot to mention in terms of the immediacy of a story, like, I know it's hard to come up with stuff on the spur of the moment, but if, as I said with that example of that person who said, oh, this just happened, I can get you somebody. Look for those opportunities where something just happened with the Affordable Care Act or with the NIH budget, or something that you see a C. diff hook for. Look for those opportunities. I can get you somebody right away in the next hour or two. That's always helpful.
The attack on the Affordable Care Act is a perverse gift to any advocate. The continuing effort to take away what years of advocacy has won the month before the loss of Peggy Lillis on March 23rd, 2010, now celebrating its 9th anniversary, not with a birthday cake with 9 candles lit on it, but by an unremitting attack from the administration in an effort to take it away, yet again, with whatever political consequences that might ensue or entail. But I say it because from a standpoint of, look at the first words of Anne's column. I really hope that all advocates can take this to heart and take this home with us, because the continuing attack on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the 2 words that are routinely omitted from the shorthand in our press and even in our popular discussion about, which we call it Obamacare, sometimes we call it the Affordable Care Act, but we routinely miss the fact that the first 2 words of this law's name are the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And what that gives us, all of us as advocates, is a constant hook, at least over the next year and a half, going into the 2020 campaign cycle, through the prosecution of the 2020 campaigns. We have a nonstop, evergreen hook for talking about our lives against the backdrop of the attack on the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. There is de facto legitimacy and urgency to any story we want to tell about C. diff based on that backdrop. And for any state that has any current legislation aimed at trying to backstop or to provide a kind of safety net in the event that any effort to undermine the Affordable Care Act succeeds, any state that is party to the lawsuits that are being waged in an effort to try to undo the protections of the Affordable Care Act, that gives us a base for telling our stories. It's a perverse gift from this jihad against patient protection. So I just want to premise we should all own that, and we should all be proud in standing up for patient protection, especially in the context of the lack of attention to this widely covered, and Joyce, I'm sure, would concur, it's often seen through a political lens. And that's a secondary and perverse gift to us also. Because anything that can put a personal story back at the center of coverage about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is a corrective to the rampant politicization and even partisanization of news coverage over the law and the lives that it continues to save at the local level and throughout the country. So that's one framing. It should be a framing incentive to all of us to use the current context and whatever pain that I think we all wrestle with by watching this politicized debate play out over a law that has very personal implications for me, for hundreds of my friends and colleagues, and for many of us in this room. But if we can tell a personal story around that, it does a great service because it takes it into the realm of our own lives and our own families and our own communities and our kitchen tables and our pillow talk in some cases, what has been mischaracterized solely as a political or partisan debate. Yeah, last question.
So this goes back to Christian's comment about people not wanting to sort of discuss this issue, and I wonder sometimes if one of the things that we need to do is to connect C. diff and help people understand it from how it's different from things they do know about. So everyone knows about E. coli or salmonella, which is not C. diff, and C. diff in many ways is much more serious. But I think we have to attach it to something, a concept they understand and are familiar with, but then differentiate it.
That's right.
And the only other comment that I have about the Affordable Care Act is that I think one of the disconnects that people lose sight of and how we can tie C. diff and the Peggy Lillis Foundation in is that the Affordable Care Act was not just about coverage. It was about a president who really tied quality to cost. And he put in incentives for hospitals to do better and to improve quality in order to reduce costs. And if we could somehow find out, like, what does one C. diff infection cost? I don't know the answer to that. But how much? About $12,000. And I remember, because my experience is back in the healthcare-associated infection realm. My mother developed a MRSA infection and got sepsis. So once they quantified that amount, and I think it was $35,000 for an HAI in a hospital, people started to really understand that, wow, this affects my insurance and the cost. So tying costs to quality of care under the Affordable Care Act is really important, and why we still need the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. It's a great point, and just as we wrap up here, I want to make sure that that point gets amplified. We need to do better in talking about the other components of the the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act that don't just relate to expansion of Medicaid, Medicare, of the ability of people to have more transparency and knowledge about the quality of care received in healthcare settings. How many people here have used Hospital Compare, the great tool of data about quality of care at the hospital level, right? Hospital Compare has, despite the wonkiness and difficulty in navigating some of the stats, it's an incredible tool that has now become deeply embedded in our evaluation and research around treatment opportunities. And Nursing Home Compare has become a great tool for evaluating where we want to put loved ones or where we would deign to keep loved ones in a rehabilitation environment. Those are benefits of the Affordable Care Act also. Basic public information portals that have been established because of quality improvement initiatives greatly expanded under the Affordable Care Act exist because of that. And one final point. Christian hears me harp on this all the time, and I just want to make sure that it gets proper recognition here. Part of the political attack on the Affordable Care Act is somehow that it's a budget buster. And one of the important rejoinders for all of us as advocates is to say this is the foremost protection for fiscal discipline that we have in our healthcare system. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act implemented some of the first widespread fiscal accountability standards for readmission at healthcare facilities in our nation's law. It is one of the foremost examples of fiscal conservatism that we have in federal policy. And it was a landmark in moving that goal forward by taking standards of healthcare quality and holding hospitals and nursing homes accountable for reimbursement rates based on readmissions for preventable conditions, including C. diff. So one of our goals, one of our opportunities as advocates is also to be a corrective to misinformation and to use misinformation when we see it or mischaracterization when we see it as an opportunity for a corrective. Again, just to wrap up, I think Joyce, many other reporters who are very diligent, long-time followers, not just of a moment, but of the arc of stories over the 10-year effort to implement and protect the Affordable Care Act. One of the things that you notice is that when misinformation occurs or when a mischaracterization of a major story occurs, many conscientious editors like Joyce will be particularly receptive to a corrective story that comes from an advocate or a reader who spots it. So my final encouragement to all of us is turn lemons into lemonade. If you see bad coverage or something that only puts something in a political lens that should have a personal lens, if you see it characterizing a helpful patient protection as hurtful or as burdensome, seize the opportunity to correct it, and through telling a personal story, through a adroit approach with an outlet, let's turn lemons into lemonade together, and let's earn a much greater recognition for C. diff, for other healthcare infections, and let's make America healthier. Thank you.